Welcome back to Articles About Revenge, your go-to channel for gripping stories of betrayal, hidden truths, and sweet justice served cold. We specialize in powerful tales of people who rise above deception and reclaim what's rightfully theirs. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Trust me, you won't want to leave, because the next story is always even more intense and satisfying. Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't go anywhere, stick around because we promise this one's going to keep you hooked from start to finish. Without further delay, here's today's story titled, I Cut Off $1,200,000 while in the ICU, the moment my greedy in-laws realized they messed up. I'm Inez. I'm 36 years old, and 2 months ago I woke up in a sterile ICU bed in St. Louis to a silence that cost me exactly $1,200,000. While I was fighting for my life through a 6-month battle with a critical illness, my husband and his family didn't just abandon me, they replaced me with a supercar. For 10 years, I was the silent engine of their luxury, funneling $10,000 every single month into their accounts. I thought I was buying family security. It turns out I was just funding my own replacement. When my lungs began to fail and my 10-month-old son Leo needed his father, my husband's family made a choice that most people wouldn't even make for a stranger. My mother-in-law's voice, cold and sharp as a scalpel, still echoes in my mind. Your sister-in-law never has these emergencies. She's busy closing a deal on a Ferrari in Europe, Hugo. Inez is just being dramatic. 3 hours after I regained enough strength to move my thumb and authorize the immediate cancellation of every single offshore transfer, the entire family, the people I had fed for a decade, burst into my room. They weren't there to check my vitals. They were there because their ATM had finally run dry. But they didn't know that standing right behind the curtain was the one person who held the power to strip them of everything they had left. Before I reveal the devastating truth of what happened when that curtain was pulled back, if you've ever felt the sting of giving your all to people who only loved your wallet, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps stories of true justice reach those who need to hear them most. Drop a comment below. Have you ever realized too late that you were being used? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the very beginning, to the first $10,000 mistake I ever made. 10 years ago, the sky over St. Louis was a bruised purple as I sat in the cramped living room of my fiancé's family home, clutching a lukewarm mug of tea. I was 26, a junior analyst with a fresh promotion and a bank account that finally had 5 digits in it. I felt invincible until Bernice, my future mother-in-law, collapsed into the armchair opposite me. She didn't just sit, she performed a controlled fall, her hand fluttering to her throat like a wounded bird. Beside her stood Hugo, the man I was supposed to marry in 4 months, looking pale and utterly defeated. "It's the heart, Inez," Bernice whispered, her voice cracking with a theatrical precision that I was too naive to question back then. "The doctors at Barnes Jewish said your father-in-law's valves are failing. The insurance won't cover the specialized surgery, and the mortgage on this house is 3 months behind. We are facing foreclosure while he's on his deathbed." I remember looking at Hugo, expecting him to offer a solution, but he only stared at his shoes. Bernice reached out her fingers, cold and trembling, as she gripped my wrist. "You're the only one with a real career, honey. You're the savior of this family. If we don't get $10,000 by the first of the month, we lose everything. We'd never ask if it wasn't life or death." She looked at a framed photo of my father-in-law, a man who at that very moment was supposedly resting in the back room, though I would later realize he was likely just hiding from the bill collectors. The weight of their expectation felt like a physical pressure in my chest. I thought about my savings, the money I'd earmarked for our wedding, and a down payment on a modest bungalow in Tower Grove Park. But how could I buy a house while my future father-in-law died in the street? That night, I logged into my Chase portal and set up the first automatic transfer. $10,000. It felt like a fortune, a massive chunk of my soul leaving my account. But Bernice's gratitude was intoxicating. She called me her golden daughter and promised this was just a temporary bridge until the family business, a struggling landscaping firm, got back on its feet. Of course, the gratitude didn't last more than 48 hours. By the end of the week, the tone had shifted. When I went over for Sunday dinner, Bernice didn't mention the money. Instead, she spent 40 minutes praising her daughter Clarissa, who had just spent her entire paycheck on a pair of designer boots. "Clarissa has such a refined eye for quality," Bernice remarked pointedly, glancing at my sensible Target flats. "Some girls just have that natural elegance. It's a gift, really." I sat there stunned into silence, realizing that the emergency money I had sent was apparently already forgotten, replaced by the urgent need to celebrate Clarissa's fashion sense. The humor in the situation was dark and bitter, like over-roasted coffee. I watched Bernice meticulously rearrange the lace doilies on her coffee table, acting as if she hadn't been sobbing on my shoulder about homelessness 2 days prior. She even had the audacity to complain that the pot roast was a bit dry because she couldn't afford the premium cuts anymore. I almost laughed out loud, wondering if she expected me to Venmo her an extra $50 for organic carrots right then and there. Hugo just hummed in agreement, his spine seemingly made of wet cardboard whenever his mother spoke. He was 31 years old, but in that house he was a toddler in a suit. As the months turned into a year, the emergency became a lifestyle. Every time I tried to bring up reducing the amount, Bernice had a new catastrophe ready. The roof was leaking. The landscaping truck needed a new transmission. My father-in-law's medication had doubled in price. I became an expert at cutting my own hair, skipping vacations, and bringing Tupperware lunches to the office, while Clarissa's Instagram feed became a catalog of St. Louis's most expensive brunch spots. I once saw her post a photo of a $300 steak with the caption, "Living my best life, thanks to the universe's blessings." I was the universe. I was the silent, invisible benefactor paying for the steak while I ate cold pasta at my desk. One particular Thanksgiving stands out in the blur of those early years. I had worked through the weekend to finish a valuation report just to earn a bonus that would cover Bernice's property tax crisis. When I arrived at the house exhausted and smelling like office coffee, Bernice didn't even look up from her phone. She was busy showing everyone Clarissa's latest hobby, equestrian lessons. "It's so important for a young woman to have a connection with noble animals," Bernice declared to the room. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my legs aching, and asked quietly if my father-in-law was feeling any better. Bernice waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, he has his good days and bad. But let's not talk about illness, Inez. It's so depressing. Tell us, why haven't you been able to afford that new car you talked about? It's a bit embarrassing for Hugo to be seen in that old sedan of yours." The irony was so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. I was the one paying for the electricity that lit the room, the turkey on the table, and likely the very chair she was sitting on, yet I was the embarrassment. I looked at Hugo, hoping for a spark of defense, a momentary lapse into manhood. He simply took a sip of his wine and said, "Mom's right, Inez. You should really focus on your image more. It reflects on all of us." That was the moment I realized the family hierarchy was a circle, and I was firmly placed on the outside holding the bag. I wasn't a member of the family. I was a high-yield investment they intended to liquidate. By year 5, the total had climbed to $600,000. I was 31 looking 40, and my life was a cycle of work and wire transfers. I had stopped questioning the medical bills because every time I did, Bernice would launch into a monologue about filial piety and how, in our family, we don't put a price tag on a parent's life. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. She turned my own morality against me, making me feel like a monster for even glancing at my own bank statement. I stayed because I loved Hugo, Or at least I loved the version of Hugo I had invented in my head, the one who would eventually stand up and say, "Enough." But that Hugo was a ghost, a figment of my imagination designed to make the exploitation bearable. I started taking on freelance consulting gigs at night, sitting in the dark of our apartment while Hugo slept, just to ensure that the $10,000 would never fail to arrive on the first of the month. I told myself it was for our future, that once the debts were paid, we would finally start our real life. I was living in a state of perpetual almost. We were almost ready to buy a house. We were almost ready to have a child. We were almost free. But the goalposts didn't just move, they grew wings and flew away every time I got close. Bernice made sure of that. She was a master architect of crisis, always building a new disaster the moment the old one was resolved. And like a fool, I kept providing the bricks. By the 7th year of our marriage, the financial drain had evolved from a series of desperate leaks into a roaring river of entitlement. I was 33, managing a high-stress portfolio for a firm downtown, and my reflection in the elevator mirror looked like a weary ghost of the girl who had once dreamed of owning a quiet garden in the suburbs. The $10,000 leaving my account every month was no longer a sacrifice. It had become an expected tax on my existence. Clarissa, however, seemed to be aging in reverse, fueled by a lifestyle that was as expensive as it was fraudulent. She had rebranded herself as a lifestyle consultant on social media, a title that apparently required a new wardrobe every season and a membership at a country club in Ladue that I couldn't even afford to walk past. It was a humid St. Louis July when the mask finally slipped. I had finished a grueling 14-hour day and decided to drop by Bernice's house to deliver some specialized heart supplements she insisted were the only thing keeping my father-in-law stable. The front door was slightly ajar to let in a breeze, and as I stepped into the foyer, the sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen. It wasn't the sound of a family in crisis. It was the jubilant, sharp cackle of people celebrating a victory. I froze, my hand still gripping the bag of expensive vitamins, as I heard Clarissa's voice rising above the rest, dripping with a condescending sweetness that turned my stomach. "I'm telling you, Mom, we should push for an extra 2,000 next month," Clarissa said, followed by the clink of ice against glass. I saw a gorgeous vintage Chanel bag at that boutique in Clayton, and it's basically calling my name. Inez just got that big quarterly bonus, right? She's probably sitting on a mountain of cash she doesn't even know how to spend. It's not like she goes anywhere anyway with those baggy suits and that tired face. I felt the blood drain from my extremities, leaving me cold despite the summer heat. My quarterly bonus had been earmarked for my own retirement fund, something I had been neglecting for years to keep their household running. Bernice's response was a low conspiratorial hum. "Don't be greedy, Clarissa. We have to play it smart. If we ask for too much at once, she might start looking at the statements too closely. For now, let's stick to the medical emergency script. It works every time because she's so desperate to be the perfect daughter-in-law. Honestly, she's so easy to manage. It's almost boring how predictable her guilt is." I heard a chair scrape against the floor, and then Hugo's voice joined in, the man who kissed me every morning, the man who saw me crying over my spreadsheets at midnight. "Just make sure the invoice looks official, Mom. She doesn't question the numbers as long as your name is on the bill. Besides, she loves being the hero. Let her keep her little martyr complex as long as the checks keep clearing." The betrayal didn't feel like a sharp stab. It felt like being slowly buried under cold, heavy sand. I stood there in the shadows of the hallway, listening to my husband, my partner, joke about my martyr complex, while Clarissa laughed about buying a luxury bag with the money I had earned by skipping meals and working through holidays. The humor they found in my exhaustion was the cruelest part. They didn't just want my money, they enjoyed the power of making me work for it. They viewed me as an appliance, a high-functioning ATM that required just enough emotional maintenance to keep the bills spitting out. I quietly backed out of the house, leaving the supplements on the porch swing. I drove to a nearby park and sat in my car, staring at the arch in the distance, feeling a strange, hollow clarity. The medical crises were a theater production. The landscaping truck that needed a new engine every 6 months was likely just a way to fund Clarissa's weekend getaways to Chicago. Every tear Bernice had shed in my presence was a calculated performance designed to trigger a specific financial response. I was a professional risk analyst, and yet I had allowed myself to be the victim of the most transparent scam in history because I wanted to believe in the sanctity of family. A week later, at a family Sunday brunch that I paid for, Clarissa arrived wearing a silk scarf that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She spent the entire meal complaining about how exhausting it was to curate her Instagram feed. People just don't understand the pressure of being a public figure. She sighed, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin. I really need a personal assistant, but the budget is just so tight. Inez, you're so good with numbers. Maybe you could help me figure out how to squeeze some extra funding from the family estate. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, the same eyes that had been mocking my tired face just days before. I looked at Bernice, who was nodding encouragingly, and then at Hugo, who was busily cutting his steak, refusing to meet my gaze. The family estate? I asked, my voice as flat as the Missouri plains. You mean my salary, Clarissa, because that's the only estate this family has. The table went silent for a heartbeat. Bernice gave a nervous little laugh, her hand fluttering to her pearls. Oh, Inez, don't be so literal. We're all in this together. Family is a collective effort, isn't it? Your success is our success. Then I suppose my exhaustion is your exhaustion too, I countered, leaning forward. The air in the room thickened. I watched as Clarissa's expression shifted from fake innocence to a sharp, defensive mask. There's no need to be hostile, she snapped. We all contribute in our own way. I provide the family's public image. I make sure people in St. Louis know the Martinez name stands for something. That has value too. I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it. She was contributing by spending my money to look rich so that people would think the family was successful. It was a hall of mirrors, and I was the only one providing the light. That evening, as Hugo and I drove home, the silence in the car was deafening. He finally broke it as we pulled into the driveway. You were a bit hard on Clarissa today. Don't you think she's sensitive about her career? It hasn't been easy for her to find her footing. I turned the engine off and looked at him in the dim light of the street lamp. Her career, Hugo. Her career is a luxury hobby funded by my overtime, and your mother's heart condition seems to fluctuate based on the sales at Nordstrom. He bristled, his face turning a blotchy red. That's unfair. Mom is doing her best. Why are you suddenly acting like every dollar is a battle? You never used to be this cold. I'm not cold, Hugo. I'm empty. I said, my voice barely a whisper. I have given until there is nothing left but bone. And I know about the medical script. I know what you all say when I'm not in the room. He froze, his hand on the door handle. For a second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a stubborn defensive wall. I don't know what you're talking about. You're just stressed. Maybe you should take a few days off? He got out of the car and slammed the door, leaving me alone in the dark. I realized then that there would be no confession, no apology, and no change. They didn't see me as a person anymore. I was a utility, and as long as the lights stayed on, they didn't care if the wires were fraying. I stayed up that night, opening a hidden spreadsheet on my laptop. I started documenting every emergency from the last 7 years. The numbers were staggering. $680,000. It wasn't just a down payment. It was a small empire. I looked at the automatic transfer button on my banking app, my finger hovering over the screen. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed more than just a cancellation. I needed a clean break, and I knew that the moment I stopped the money, the family I thought I had would vanish like smoke. I wasn't just afraid of losing them. I was afraid of admitting that I had been the fool in my own story for nearly a decade. The human body has a strange way of screaming when the soul has been silenced for too long. By the time I reached the 10th year of funding Bernice's theatrical medical crises and Clarissa's designer delusions, my own health decided to present a bill that I couldn't ignore. It started as a persistent dull ache in my chest and a fatigue so heavy it felt like I was wading through deep water every time I walked to my office at the firm. I ignored it for months, telling myself it was just the stress of managing $1 million portfolio while acting as a full-time benefactor for people who viewed me as a line item. But when I collapsed in the middle of a high-stakes meeting in downtown St. Louis, the facade of my strength finally shattered. I woke up in a diagnostic ward, the smell of antiseptic sharp in my nostrils, and a doctor with a grave expression standing at the foot of my bed. The diagnosis was a rare, aggressive autoimmune condition that had begun to attack my lungs. I needed immediate intensive treatment and at least 6 months of complete rest. As I sat there clutching the hospital gown, my first thought wasn't about my own life. It was a conditioned reflex of fear about how I would maintain the monthly $10,000 transfer if I couldn't work. It is a pathetic testament to Bernice's 10-year indoctrination that my primary concern while facing a life-threatening illness was the potential disappointment of my exploiters. When Hugo finally arrived, he didn't rush to my side with a hug or a word of comfort. He stood in the doorway checking his watch, looking more annoyed by the parking fees than worried about my survival. I handed him the printed diagnosis, my hands trembling. He skimmed it with a frown that deepened into a scowl. 6 months, Inez. Are you serious? The doctor said you need total rest. There was no sympathy in his voice, only a sharp, jagged edge of inconvenience. He sat on the edge of the plastic chair, not touching me. Do you have any idea how bad the timing is? Clarissa just put down a non-refundable deposit for that European automotive tour. She's finally getting the chance to buy that limited edition supercar she's been talking about for years. It's her big break for her brand. I stared at him, my breath hitching in my scarred lungs. Hugo, I might die. I can barely breathe, and you're talking about your sister's car. He had the audacity to sigh, a long, weary sound as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. Don't be dramatic, Inez. The doctor said you're stable. You always have this way of making everything about you whenever the family has a big milestone. It's like you can't stand not being the center of attention. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. I had spent a decade being the invisible scaffolding for their lives, and the one moment I actually needed support, I was accused of being a spotlight hog. The next afternoon, Bernice made her grand entrance. She didn't bring flowers. She brought a stack of unpaid invoices for her house maintenance. She swept into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume, the kind that costs $300 an ounce, bought with my money, and settled herself at the foot of my bed. Now, Inez, Hugo told me about your little health scare. She began, her voice dripping with that forced saccharine sweetness I had grown to loathe. It's very unfortunate, really, but we've been looking at the finances, and with you taking a leave of absence, we're worried about the shortfall. Clarissa needs an extra $5,000 this month to secure the shipping for the new car. You know how important image is in her industry. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. Bernice, I'm going on disability. I'll only be receiving 60% of my salary. I can't even cover my own medical copays and keep sending you $10,000, let alone an extra 5. The mask of the loving mother slipped, instantly revealing the sharp, predatory greed beneath. Her eyes narrowed and her posture stiffened. Well, that's simply not acceptable. We have obligations. Your father-in-law's health is delicate, though he's miraculously felt better since we started discussing the new garage for Clarissa's car, and we depend on that income. Can't you just take on some freelance consulting from your bed? You're just sitting here anyway. The sheer absurdity of her suggestion would have been funny if it weren't so monstrous. She was asking a woman with failing lungs to work overtime from a hospital bed so that her daughter could buy a Ferrari. I looked at Bernice, really looked at her, and saw a black hole of entitlement that would never be filled. I'm not a machine, Bernice. I'm a human being and I'm sick. She scoffed, standing up and smoothing her silk skirt. We all have our cross to bear, Inez. Your sister-in-law never has these emergencies. She stays focused. She stays productive. Maybe if you managed your stress better, you wouldn't be in this position. It's quite selfish of you to let your health interfere with the family's progress. Hugo walked in just as she was finishing her lecture. Instead of defending me, he nodded in agreement. Mom's right. We already told the dealership the funds were guaranteed. If you back out now, it makes the whole family look like frauds. Can't you just dip into your 401k? It's for emergencies, isn't it? I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a dry, racking cough that left me gasping for air. My retirement fund. The only thing I had left for my son Leo's future was being eyed as a down payment for a supercar. They didn't see my illness as a tragedy. They saw it as a breach of contract. For the next 3 days, my hospital room became a courtroom where I was the defendant. Every visit from Hugo was a negotiation. He would spend 10 minutes asking if I wanted water and 50 minutes explaining why we really needed to keep the transfers at the full amount. He even suggested I sell my car, the modest sedan they had mocked for years, to cover the gap. You won't be driving for 6 months anyway, he reasoned with a chilling lack of empathy. I watched him talk, his lips moving, but I was focused on the realization that I was married to a stranger. I was married to a man who would happily watch me wither away as long as the bank alerts on his phone didn't stop. The final straw came when Clarissa herself called me. I expected a half-hearted, get well soon, but instead I got a frantic monologue about leather upholstery. Inez, you have to talk to Hugo. He said you're being difficult about the extra 5,000. Don't you understand that this car is an investment in my brand? I'll have 50,000 new followers by next month. Why are you being so small-minded? It's just money. You can always make more once you decide to get better. I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling, the sound of the heart monitor, the only thing keeping me anchored. The family I had sacrificed a decade for was nothing more than a group of high-end scavengers. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to get back to work. I looked at the photo of Leo on my bedside table, my 10-month-old son, who deserved a mother who was alive and a future that wasn't stolen by greedy in-laws. I realized then that if I stayed on this path, I would die, and they would probably complain about the funeral costs while driving Clarissa's new car. The martyr complex Hugo had joked about was over. I was no longer a hero. I was a survivor, and the first step to surviving was recognizing that my predators were sitting right in my room complaining about the hospital coffee. The transition from a stable hospital room to the white-knuckle intensity of the intensive care unit happened in a blur of frantic alarms and shouting doctors. My lungs, the very organs that had been silently struggling for years under the weight of my exhaustion, finally decided to stop fighting. As the medical team in St. Louis rushed me behind the double doors of the ICU, I felt like a drowning woman watching the shore vanish. Everything was cold, rhythmic, and terrifyingly efficient. But the physical agony of a collapsed lung was nothing compared to the emotional frostbite that set in when I saw Hugo standing on the other side of the glass, holding his luggage instead of my hand. I was hooked up to a ventilator, a machine hissing the air into my body that I couldn't draw for myself. Through the haze of sedatives and pain, I watched my husband leaning against the nurse's station, looking more like a man waiting for a delayed flight than a husband watching his wife hover between life and death. He didn't even look at me. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, likely checking the exchange rate for euros. When Bernice arrived, she wasn't wearing the face of a grieving mother-in-law. She looked radiant, dressed in a designer travel suit that probably cost as much as my entire month's treatment. They weren't there to say goodbye. They were there to announce their departure. Hugo finally stepped into the room, keeping a safe distance from the tubes and monitors as if my illness were contagious. He didn't lean down to kiss my forehead or tell me he loved me. Instead, he adjusted his collar and cleared his throat. Inez. I know the timing is bad, but Clarissa is already in Milan. The gala for the supercar delivery is tomorrow night, and she needs me there for the media photos. My mother is coming too. We've already booked the private car from the airport. I tried to speak, but the tube in my throat turned my protest into a pathetic, wet gurgle. My eyes filled with tears, pleading with him to look at the baby monitor sitting on my bedside table, the one showing our 10-month-old son Leo, who was currently being watched by a hospital-assigned stranger because my husband refused to stay. Don't give me that look. Hugo snapped, his voice echoing with a chilling defensive irritability. Leo is fine. The social worker found a temporary caregiver. It's only for 10 days. I can't miss this, Inez. This car is the foundation of Clarissa's new brand. If I stay here just to watch you sleep, I'm flushing her future down the toilet. You're stable now. The nurses said you're stable. He was lying to himself, ignoring the critical status flashing on my monitor. He was choosing a gala in Italy and a Ferrari over the mother of his child. I reached out a trembling hand, trying to grab his sleeve, but he stepped back, a look of genuine disgust flickering across his face at the sight of my weakness. Bernice stepped into the room, then her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She didn't even acknowledge the machine breathing for me. She simply checked her reflection in the darkened screen of my heart monitor and adjusted her silk scarf. Honestly, Inez, the drama is getting a bit old, she said, her voice dripping with a casual, polished cruelty. Hugo told me you were trying to guilt-trip him into staying. Your sister-in-law never has these emergencies, you know. Clarissa is so organized, so put together. She's out there making a name for this family while you're lying here, making everything difficult. It's your responsibility to be a supportive wife, not a burden. The words, your responsibility, felt like a physical blow. For 10 years, I had shouldered every responsibility they had ever shirked. I had been their bank, their safety net, and their scapegoat. And here she was, standing over my dying body, telling me that my failure to stay healthy was a personal insult to Clarissa's itinerary. Bernice leaned in closer, her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of hospital chemicals. We'll be back in 2 weeks. By then, I expect you to be out of this bed and back at your desk. We've already committed to the maintenance fees for the new vehicle, and your disability check won't cover even a fraction of it. You need to pull yourself together. Being sick is a luxury we simply can't afford right now. They walked out together, their laughter echoing in the hallway, as they discussed which restaurants they wanted to visit in Milan. They didn't look back. They didn't ask the doctor for a prognosis. They left me in a room filled with machines and the crushing realization that I was utterly alone. For an hour I lay there in the dark, the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, the only sound in the room. I thought about Leo, my beautiful boy, being held by a stranger while his father was sipping champagne over a supercar. The fire of motherly instinct began to burn through the fog of my illness. I wasn't just a martyr anymore. I was a mother whose child had been abandoned by a coward. Around midnight, a nurse came in to check my vitals. Her name was Elena, a woman with kind eyes and a steady hand. She noticed the baby monitor and the lack of family in the room. "Where is your husband, honey?" she asked softly. I couldn't speak, but the look in my eyes told her everything. She sat down beside me and took my hand. "I've seen a lot of things in this ward," she whispered, "but I've never seen a woman fight this hard for air while her family is posting photos from a first-class lounge." She pulled out her own phone and showed me a post that had just gone live on Clarissa's Instagram. There they were, Hugo, Bernice, and Clarissa clinking glasses in a luxury airport lounge. The caption read, "Finally off to Italy. Family is everything. So blessed to have people who support my dreams no matter what." That post was the final spark, The $1,200,000 I had given them over a decade flashed before my eyes like a taunting ledger. I had paid for those tickets. I had paid for that champagne. I had paid for the very arrogance they were using to mock my suffering. My heart rate began to climb, not from the illness but from a cold, crystalline fury that felt more powerful than any medication. I realized then that if I died, they would win. They would take my life insurance, they would take Leo, and they would spend every cent on leather seats and designer sunglasses. I refused to let that happen. I gestured frantically for a pen and paper. My hand was shaking so violently I could barely grip the pen Elena handed me, but I managed to scrawl 3 words: "Call Sterling, now." Sterling was my childhood friend and a high-level corporate attorney who managed my private investments, the few things I had kept hidden from Hugo's greed. Elena didn't ask questions. She saw the desperation in my face and found my phone in the bedside drawer. As she dialed the number, I felt a strange shift in the air. The woman who had spent 10 years saying yes to every demand, every lie, and every manipulation was gone. In her place was a woman who was ready to burn the bridge while she was still standing on it. By the time Sterling answered, the sun was beginning to peek over the St. Louis skyline. Through the phone on speaker, I heard his voice sharp and protective. I couldn't talk, but I didn't need to. I had already authorized him years ago to act in my stead if I was incapacitated. I used the last of my strength to tap a specific code on the phone screen, a signal we had established for a nuclear option regarding my accounts. As the first transfer to their joint account for the Milan trip was flagged and reversed in real time, I watched the heart monitor stabilize. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't need the machine to tell me how to breathe. I was breathing for revenge. By the second day of my husband's luxury excursion in Milan, the quiet of the ICU was no longer a symbol of abandonment, but a tactical advantage. The fury that had ignited in my chest was better than any oxygen treatment. It gave me a clarity I hadn't possessed in a decade. When Sterling, my attorney, and the only man I trusted with my financial secrets, walked into the room, he didn't look like a visitor. He looked like an executioner. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and a look of cold, professional indignation. Beside him was Arthur Hugo's grandfather, a man whose presence usually commanded a room, but today he looked like a person who had just discovered his own house was infested with rats. "Inez, I am so sorry." Arthur whispered, his voice thick with a disappointment that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the bloodline he had sired. He took my hand, his grip steady and warm. "Sterling showed me the ledgers. I've lived 80 years in St. Louis, and I have never seen such a calculated theft disguised as family devotion." "Shh." I squeezed his hand, my voice returning in a raspy, painful whisper, as the nurses had finally downgraded my breathing support. I didn't want comfort. I wanted the nuclear option we had discussed over the phone. Sterling opened his laptop on my rolling hospital table, the glow of the screen reflecting the grim determination on all our faces. The first thing Sterling did was pull up the real-time activity on the joint account I had funded for 10 years. There at a high-end boutique near the Duomo. Sterling noted his fingers dancing across the keys with a predatory rhythm. Hugo just tried to authorize a $30,000 charge for a custom leather interior upgrade for Clarissa's new toy. It was flagged, but not yet blocked. I nodded, a dry, sharp smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. With one digital stroke, Sterling initiated the total asset freeze. It wasn't just my monthly transfers that stopped. It was the access to every penny of the $1,200,000 I had funneled into the Martinez family trust, a trust I had secretly structured with a health and incapacity clause that allowed me to claw back funds if they were misused. "It's done," Sterling said, leaning back as the confirmation flashed on the screen. "Every card in Hugo's wallet is now a worthless piece of plastic. The mortgage on Bernice's house, which is held in your name, is being transitioned to a foreclosure notice. And Clarissa, That supercar she's currently posing with in Milan. The final wire transfer for the balance was just cancelled. She's effectively standing next to a very expensive piece of metal that she no longer owns. I felt a strange light sensation in my chest, not the pain of my condition, but the weight of 10 years of exploitation lifting away. But the financial strike was only half of the plan. Arthur stood up, pulling a thick manila envelope from his coat. While Sterling was tracking the money, I was tracking the heart condition, he said, his jaw tightening. I went to Bernice's house yesterday while they were at the airport. I told my son Hugo's father that I was there to take him to an emergency specialist I'd hired. Arthur let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Inez, the man, was in the backyard practicing his golf swing. He's been healthy for 7 years. He told me Bernice said the illness was the only way to keep you motivated to work those long hours at the firm. They've been using his valves as a psychological whip to keep the ATM running. Hearing the confirmation of the lie didn't hurt as much as I expected. It was the final piece of a puzzle that had been ugly from the start. Document everything, Arthur, I whispered, my voice growing stronger with every second of justice. Every fake invoice, every fraudulent medical claim. I want them to realize that the person they called dramatic is the same person who now holds the keys to their prison cells. Sterling began drafting the legal notices, the sound of his typing a beautiful rhythmic percussion in the sterile room. We weren't just cutting them off. We were preparing a forensic audit that would expose 10 years of financial abuse. The humor of the situation began to manifest about an hour later when my phone sitting on the bedside table began to vibrate incessantly. It was Hugo, then Bernice, then Clarissa. They were clearly at a checkout counter somewhere in Italy facing the ultimate humiliation of a declined message. I didn't answer. I simply watched the screen light up with their names, a silent testimony to their panic. Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound. I imagine the champagne at the gala doesn't taste quite as sweet when the credit limit is 0. Hugo is currently sending frantic texts asking if there's a glitch in the St. Louis banking system. I've prepared an automated response informing him that all accounts are under investigation for fraud. Arthur sat in the chair beside me, looking at the photo of my son Leo. I've already coordinated with the hospital, Inez. Leo is being moved to my house this afternoon. My private staff will care for him until you're discharged. No more strangers, and certainly no more Hugo. I felt a tear of genuine relief roll down my cheek. The man I had once viewed as a distant patriarch was now my fiercest protector. He wasn't doing this for the money. He was doing it because he couldn't stand the thought of his great-grandson being raised by people who viewed a supercar as more valuable than a mother's life. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, Sterling finalized the no-contact order. The moment they land back at Lambert International, they'll be served. Not by a family member, but by a process server. They won't even be allowed to step foot in your apartment. Hugo's clothes will be in a storage unit and the key will be at my office. We're going nuclear, Inez. No mediation, no apologies, no family meetings. We are burning the bridge and salting the earth so nothing can ever grow there again. I looked out the window at the city of St. Louis, feeling a profound sense of peace. For 10 years, I had been the silent victim in a play I didn't know was being performed. Today, I had rewritten the ending. Bernice had spent a decade telling me that this is what family does. But she had forgotten one crucial detail: family is a two-way street, and she had been driving on the wrong side for too long. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic hiss of my oxygen machine, sounding like a countdown to their total destruction. They thought they were in Milan celebrating a new car, but they were actually attending the funeral of their own greed. And I was the one who had finally turned out the lights. The silence of the hospital wing was shattered less than 48 hours after Sterling initiated the freeze. I didn't need a phone call to know they were back. The sound of Bernice's frantic, high-pitched screech echoing through the corridor was enough to tell me the flight from Milan had landed. I sat up in my bed, no longer the fragile patient they had abandoned, but a woman fortified by the cold truth and the presence of my allies. Arthur stood by the window, his back to the door, looking like a monolith of silent judgment, while Sterling sat calmly in the corner, his briefcase open, like a predator waiting for its prey to walk into the trap. The door burst open with such force it slammed against the wall. Bernice led the charge, her face a blotchy, frantic mess of smeared, expensive makeup and pure, unadulterated fury. Behind her, Hugo looked like a man whose world had collapsed, his eyes wide and desperate, clutching a useless stack of credit cards. Clarissa followed, still wearing her Italian influencer outfit, though she looked considerably less glamorous after being kicked out of a luxury hotel in the middle of the night. They didn't even look at the heart monitor or the scars on my chest. They looked at me as if I were a malfunctioning appliance that had suddenly developed the audacity to say, "No." "Inez, what on earth have you done?" Bernice screamed, her voice cracking as she rushed toward my bed. She didn't reach out to touch me in comfort. She reached for the phone on my bedside table. "Every single card is declined. My accounts are frozen. We were thrown out of the gala like common criminals. Clarissa's car, the car that was supposed to change everything, is being held at the dealership because the wire transfer failed. Do you have any idea how much you've embarrassed us?" I watched her, feeling a strange, detached amusement. The emergency this time wasn't a heart valve or a leaking roof. It was the loss of a status symbol. Hugo stepped forward, his voice a pathetic whine that made my skin crawl. "Inez, honey, Sterling said you're the one behind this. Tell him it's a mistake. The shipping company is threatening to sue Clarissa for breach of contract. We need $50,000 right now just to stop the legal action. I know you're upset about the Italy trip, but this is the family's future we're talking about. Don't be so petty." He actually had the nerve to call me petty while I was still tethered to an oxygen tank. I looked at him, the man I had shared 10 years and a child with, and saw absolutely nothing but a parasite looking for its next meal. "The only mistake I made was not doing this a decade ago," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The transfers are over, Hugo. The family business is officially insolvent because I've stopped being your bank." Clarissa pushed past her brother, her eyes flashing with a venomous greed. "You selfish, miserable woman. You're just jealous because I have a brand, and you're just a corporate drone. That car was my ticket to the top. You're trying to ruin me because you can't stand seeing me successful." She lunged toward me, but Arthur turned from the window, his voice booming with a judicial authority that silenced the room instantly. "Sit down, Clarissa," Arthur barked. The sheer power in his voice sent her reeling back. The family finally noticed him standing there, and the blood drained from Bernice's face. "Dad, what are you doing here?" She stammered, her hand fluttering to her throat in that familiar theatrical gesture. Arthur stepped into the center of the room, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. "I'm here to witness the end of your charade, Bernice. I've seen the forensic audit. I've seen the fake medical bills you've been forging for 7 years. I've seen the Instagram posts of you sipping champagne in Milan while your daughter-in-law was in a coma and your grandson was being held by a social worker." Bernice tried to launch into her script, her eyes welling with crocodile tears. "Dad, you don't understand the stress of the illness." Arthur cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I understand perfectly. I went to the house, Bernice. I spoke to my son. He told me everything. He told me you've been healthy for years and that the heart condition was a fiction you created to keep Inez working 60 hours a week. You've stolen $1,200,000 from this woman, and you used it to buy leather seats and designer scarves while she nearly died." The room went deathly still. Hugo looked at his mother, then at me, the realization finally sinking in that the game was over. "Inez," he started, his voice trembling. "We can fix this. We're family. We can go to counseling. Just release the funds for the shipping and we'll talk about everything else. I'll stay here every night until you're discharged, I promise." The irony was so sharp it was almost laughable. He was offering me support now that the price was $50,000 in legal fees. You won't be staying anywhere. Hugo. Sterling interrupted, standing up and handing Hugo a thick stack of legal documents. This is a temporary restraining order. You are to stay 500 feet away from Inez and your son Leo. Your access to the apartment has been terminated. Your belongings have already been moved to a storage locker in North St. Louis. As for the legal action in Italy, that's your problem. Since the funds were proven to be obtained through fraudulent medical claims, the bank has already initiated a clawback process. Bernice let out a strangled cry, her polished veneer finally shattering into a jagged, ugly fury. You can't do this. I'll tell everyone in St. Louis. What a heartless monster you are. I'll go on social media. I'll tell them you're keeping a child from his father. She turned to Clarissa, who was already frantically typing on her phone, likely trying to spin a narrative of betrayal to her followers. I looked at them, feeling a profound sense of peace. Go ahead, Bernice, I said, leaning back against the pillows. Tell them everything. But make sure to include the part where you chose a Ferrari over your dying daughter-in-law. See how many likes you get for that. Arthur signaled to the hospital's security guards who were standing just outside the door. Get them out of here, he commanded. They are no longer permitted on this floor. If they attempt to contact Inez again, they will be arrested for harassment. As the security guards moved in, Bernice began to scream, a primal, ugly sound of a woman who had finally lost her grip on her golden goose. Clarissa tried to take a photo of the abuse for her brand, but a guard blocked her lens and escorted her out. Hugo was the last to leave. He looked back at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, belated regret, but I simply turned my head away. When the door finally closed, the silence that returned was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Arthur sat down in the chair and let out a long, weary sigh. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner, Inez. I should have protected you from them years ago. I reached out and squeezed his hand. You're here now, Arthur. That's all that matters. Sterling began finalizing the next phase of the legal strike, but I wasn't focused on the money anymore. I was focused on the fact that for the first time in a decade, the air in my lungs felt clean. The parasites were gone, and the future was finally exclusively mine. 3 months after the storm in the ICU settled the air in my new home, in a quiet suburb of St. Louis, finally tasted like peace. My lungs had healed more quickly than the doctors expected, a phenomenon my specialist attributed to a remarkable lack of stress. It turns out that when you stop carrying the financial and emotional weight of 4 ungrateful adults, your body finds a way to mend itself. I was no longer the woman who skipped meals to fund someone else's vanity. I was a mother, a survivor, and for the first time in 10 years, I was the sole author of my own life. The legal aftermath was a clinical, efficient destruction of everything Bernice and Hugo had built on the foundation of my labor. With Sterling's forensic audit and Arthur's unwavering testimony, the court granted me absolute sole custody of Leo. Hugo was granted supervised visitation, but even that was a hollow victory for him. Without my income to maintain his appearance of success, he struggled to find his footing. He tried to move back into his mother's house, but that house no longer existed. Since I held the title to the property and had documented the 10 years of fraudulent medical claims used to pay the mortgage, I forced a sale. The family home was liquidated to reimburse a fraction of the $1,200,000 they had siphoned away. Bernice's fall from social grace was the talk of the local community. Without the designer clothes and the ability to host lavish dinners, her friends vanished as quickly as a Missouri summer thunderstorm. She was forced into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she used to mock surviving on a small pension and the cold shoulder of the Martinez extended family. Arthur made sure the entire clan knew exactly what she had done. In a family that valued honor and tradition, her betrayal was an unforgivable sin. She spent her days calling Hugo to complain about the unfairness of the world, but there was no one left to pay the bill for her drama. As for Clarissa, her downfall was almost poetic in its irony. The limited edition supercar she had worshipped like a deity was never delivered. The Italian dealership, faced with a cancelled wire transfer and a fraud investigation, simply moved on to the next buyer. The deposit she had begged for was lost to legal fees. Her influencer brand, built on a lie of effortless wealth, crumbled when she had to take a job as a floor manager at a discount department store. I heard she recently posted a video crying about toxic family dynamics, but it garnered more laughter than sympathy. People have a way of seeing through the glitter once the lights go out. I watched Leo play on the grass of our new backyard, his laughter a bright silver sound that made every struggle worthwhile. Arthur was there, sitting in a lawn chair, teaching Leo how to hold a tiny baseball bat. The connection between them was real, unburdened by expectations or invoices. I realized then that I hadn't just saved myself. I had saved my son from a legacy of greed and manipulation. He would grow up knowing that love isn't something you buy with a monthly transfer, and family isn't a group of people who use you until you break. Looking back on those 10 years, I've learned a lesson that I want to share with everyone who has stayed with my story until now. Guilt is a powerful weapon, but it is only effective if you give others the power to hold it. For a decade, I allowed my own kindness to be used as a shackle. I thought I was being a good person by giving until I had nothing left, but I was actually just being a willing victim. There is a profound difference between helping someone in need and enabling someone's greed. If someone only loves you when your hands are full of gifts, then they never loved you at all. They loved the gifts. Choosing yourself is not an act of selfishness, it is an act of survival. I hope you never have to face a critical illness in a lonely hospital room to realize your own worth. I hope you find the strength to draw your boundaries before the wires are frayed and the lights go out. Your time, your energy, and your hard-earned success belong to you and the people who truly show up for you when the world goes dark. Don't set yourself on fire just to keep people warm who won't even bring you a glass of water while you're burning. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to my journey. Your support and your presence have meant the world to me during my recovery. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to share these real, powerful stories of justice and self-discovery. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your own peace? What did you learn from it? Your insights help us grow and make our future stories even better. Please share this story with your friends and family. You never know who might need to hear these words today. I wish you all abundant health, the best of luck in your own journeys, and the wisdom to always know your own value. Stay strong, keep your boundaries firm, and remember that you are enough exactly as you are. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in our next story. God bless you all.